Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we are going deep into a real-world experiment, like literally happening right now, out in the Amazon rainforest. It's a story that involves cattle ranchers and conservationists and the insight of a really remarkable biologist. You gave me some stuff to go through, and it was just chock full of insights about what happens when a vast and interconnected natural habitat like the Amazon gets broken up.
Yeah. The material that you gave me really digs deep into the biological dynamics of forest fragments project. It's it's often referred to as BDFFP for short. And we're going to be exploring how it started and some of the really important research that's happened there, and then think about what these findings tell us about how humans are impacting a world that's constantly being altered. Your sources do a really good job of showing what kind of effort is involved in this and how dedicated the scientists are that are actually studying these kind of isolated forest patches. Yeah.
Yeah. And for everyone listening, our goal is to explain why this project is considered so important and highlight some of the really surprising things that we've learned, and then connect it to this bigger picture of, how we as humans are changing the natural world. We want to give you a really solid understanding of this topic, which is pretty complex, without overwhelming you with too much scientific jargon. Okay, so let's dive right in. Where did this experiment actually begin?
Well, the story of the BDFFP, it all started north of Manaus, Brazil. Uh, the sources you sent me, they mentioned the BR-174 highway and then a turnoff to this unpaved road, the ZF3, and then finally Reserve 1202, located behind just a simple wooden gate. This is where it all starts.
That's kind of an unlikely place for such a groundbreaking project. So your sources paint a really interesting picture of the situation back then. So in the 1970s, the Brazilian government was actually encouraging deforestation, offering financial incentives to ranchers to clear land, to make space for cattle ranching. But at the same time, Brazilian law also required that landowners in the Amazon had to leave half of their forest intact. It sounds like a real clash of priorities.
It really was.
Yeah.
Into this very unusual situation stepped Tom Lovejoy. He's an American biologist, and he had a very forward-thinking idea. He asked, could they arrange that 50% that they had to leave standing? Could they arrange it in a way that would actually become a giant experiment?
That's pretty brilliant. So instead of having just random bits of leftover forest, Lovejoy saw a chance to create a network of isolated fragments, all different sizes that could be studied over time. And did the Brazilians actually go for this?
They did. It's quite remarkable. Lovejoy actually traveled to Manaus and presented his idea, and they actually embraced it. So the project has been going now for over 30 years, which is something your sources emphasize.
That's
And it's been so influential that it's trained a generation of scientists that are now being called fragmentologists. And some even say it's the most important ecological experiment ever done.
Wow, all from a single insightful question. So these forest fragments, they're not just random patches of trees, right? Your sources paint a pretty vivid picture. Reserve 1202, for example, is described as an almost perfect square. 25 acres of untouched rainforest surrounded by, well, nothing. From the air, it actually looks like a green raft floating in this sea of brown.
Yeah, it's a striking image for sure. And Reserve 1202 is just one piece of this larger archipelago of Amazonian islands, as your sources call it. Each of these fragments has a very precise scientific-sounding name, like Reserve 1112, 1301, 2107. It really highlights the kind of rigorous approach. Some are smaller, some are larger, but each one is carefully defined for study.
And it's not like they're just letting nature run its course in these fragments, right? The research sounds incredibly in-depth. Botanists tagging every single tree, ornithologists banding birds, entomologists counting fruit flies. One of your sources even describes a Portuguese graduate student who's studying bats there. It sounds like a living laboratory.
It is a really unique one. And the amount of scrutiny that goes into studying these small areas, it makes you think about how much humans have actually changed the planet, as your sources point out. Think about this. We've converted over half of the Earth's ice-free land for agriculture and pasture, but also for our cities, our towns. It adds up to something like 27 million square miles.
That's a huge chunk of the planet, so that doesn't leave much that you would actually consider wild.
Not really. Your sources point out that even the remaining 23 million square miles, that's not covered in ice. A lot of it is actually fragmented. They talk about these things called anthromes, like urban areas, croplands, and even populated forests. These are landscapes that have been significantly changed by human activity.
So these anthromes, they cover most of the land. And that leaves only about 11 million square miles that we can actually classify as true wildlands. And even then, a lot of those areas, like parts of the Amazon, are still being chopped up. Like your sources mentioned that fishbone pattern of deforestation in Brazil, where roads cut through the forest, leaving these long, thin strips of trees on either side.
Right, like a fish skeleton. And what's really interesting is that unnatural square shape of Reserve 1202, which seems so artificial, it's actually starting to look more and more like the remaining natural areas we have left in the world. Kind of a sobering thought.
Yeah, definitely. So let's zoom in on some of the research that's actually been happening in these islands on dry land. You highlighted the work of an ornithologist named Mario Conehaft. He's a key figure in the BDFFP, right?
He is. He's been involved with this project since the mid-1980s.
Mm.
And your sources do a great job of capturing his passion. For birds, they contrast it with another researcher who's really focused on trees. Conehaft, he has this uncanny ability to identify Amazonian birds just by listening to their calls.
Which is so important. Your sources mentioned that a lot of Amazonian birds, they can look incredibly similar, but sound totally different. So Conehaft thinks that for too long we've relied on visual identification, and we've kind of missed these subtle differences in their songs. It turns out that birds that look almost identical can actually have totally different calls, which means that they're genetically distinct species. And he's even working on a paper right now that identifies several new species he found just through listening.
Amazing. It makes you realize how much diversity there is out there that we just can't see with our own eyes. In fact, your source mentions one of those potential new species, a nocturnal bird. Its call is like this haunting sound that's even part of local folklore. And to get a better sense of these birds, Conehaft and your source went out to Reserve 1202 before sunrise.
Wow, to see the birds.
Yeah. They climbed up this 130-foot tall metal tower. It was pretty rusty, too. To get this panoramic view of the forest canopy, Conehaft, he had this powerful telescope and even an iPod, loaded with bird calls that he would play, trying to attract birds that might be hidden from view.
That sounds pretty amazing, like being in a real-life nature documentary.
Totally. Your source describes seeing a slate-colored hawk, a swallow-tailed kite, a white-tailed titira, a golden-winged parakeet, and this really beautiful red-legged honeycreeper. But beyond just identifying the birds, Conehaft's long-term work, doing these bird censuses in the fragments, has revealed something pretty remarkable. He calls it the refugee effect.
That's counterintuitive. Wouldn't you expect fewer birds in a smaller area?
Right. But here's the thing. In the beginning, right after they cleared the surrounding forest, they actually saw an increase in the number of birds, and sometimes even in the number of different species in the fragments. The idea is that birds from the areas that were cut down, they sought refuge in these remaining patches of forest.
So it's like the fragments were actually havens for biodiversity, at least for a while.
Exactly. But that initial increase didn't last. Over time, both the total number of birds and the variety of bird species in the fragments, they started to go down, and they kept declining. Conehaft emphasizes that it wasn't just dropping to a new lower level. It was this steady degradation in diversity. And this pattern, it wasn't just in birds. They saw it in other organisms, too.
So while it might seem encouraging at first that more birds flock to these fragments, it's often misleading. It doesn't mean the fragment is thriving. It's more like a sign of the surrounding habitat collapsing. And it's often a prelude to a much longer and more worrisome decline.
Exactly. It's a really important point. Fragmentation doesn't just cause an immediate loss of species. It triggers this longer-term process of decline.
So speaking of long-term processes, your source then shifts gears to talk about island biogeography. They're drawing these parallels between the forest fragments and real islands.
And this is where the idea of these islands on dry land gets really interesting. Real islands, whether they're volcanic islands or those land bridge islands that were once connected to continents, they tend to have fewer species than mainland areas. This is mainly because it's harder for new species to get to an island and easier for existing species to go extinct because of their smaller size and isolation.
And land bridge islands are especially fascinating, right? They start with the same set of species as the mainland, but then once sea levels rise and they're cut off, they start losing species.
Right. And this ongoing loss of species after they get isolated, it's called relaxation, which, as your source points out, is a pretty peaceful-sounding term for what it actually describes. This process can take a really long time, even thousands of years. And in some cases, it might still be going on.
So why does this happen? Even if there seems to be enough suitable habitat left on the island, or in the forest fragment for that matter.
Ecologists think it has to do with random events and the challenges of small populations. Smaller areas can only support fewer individuals, and small populations are way more vulnerable to things like a bad storm, disease outbreaks, or even just having too many males or females. Your source gives this really clear example of a single breeding pair of birds. They face a whole bunch of bad luck, and eventually the species just disappears from that location. Think of it like a raffle. If you only have one ticket, your chances of winning are pretty slim. Similarly, a small population has a lower chance of surviving just by chance.
Makes sense. And the smaller the population, the higher the chance that something random will wipe them out. Your source even mentions Jared Diamond's research. On burchellii Island, he found a clear link between small population sizes and extinctions in bird populations.
Exactly. And the thing that really separates islands and fragmented habitats from the mainland is how difficult it is for them to recolonize. On the mainland, if a species disappears from a certain area, other individuals from nearby population can usually move in and reestablish it. But for an isolated fragment or an island, that's much harder, maybe even impossible. Your source mentions how some bird species at BDFFP, like the white-crowned manakins, they're willing to cross cleared areas like roads. But others, like the scale-backed antbird, they're much more hesitant to leave the forest, so it's less likely they'll be able to repopulate a fragment.
It's not just about destroying habitat. It's about the long-term impact of this isolation and the disruption of these natural processes that can have huge consequences.
Absolutely.
So now your source takes us from these big picture patterns to the incredible details of the rainforest itself. They use this fascinating example of army ants.
It's a great way to illustrate that even a forest that might seem quiet or even empty to us is actually teeming with activity. Like E.O. Wilson once said, it's a little world underneath. Conehaft, he points out all this insect activity, stick bugs, spiders, cicada larvae, termite nests, even ants that have this special relationship with a plant called a melastome.
And Conehaft, he's used to being a general naturalist. In other environments, he said it's just impossible to be a generalist in the Amazon. There's just too much biodiversity. He even suggests that this huge number of different species could lead to low population densities for each individual species, which is kind of a paradox. It could drive even more speciation because the species are isolated from each other, but it also makes them more vulnerable to extinction.
Right, it's this fascinating interplay between diversity and vulnerability.
And then there's the encounter with the army ant column, Eciton burchellii. Your source describes this almost endless stream of reddish-brown ants marching across a fallen log.
These aren't your everyday ants. Army ants are nomads. They don't build a permanent nest. They spend their lives either foraging for food or in these temporary bivouacs made up of the ants themselves. They're incredibly efficient predators.
Really? And I'm guessing all that activity creates opportunities for other species.
You bet. Your source mentions these obligate ant followers, birds like the rufous-throated antbird. They're almost always found near army ant swarms. Feeding on the insects the ants flush out. There are also opportunistic ant followers, even things like butterflies that feed on the antbird's droppings and parasitic flies that go after the insects stirred up by the ants. You know, the Rettenmeyers, they did research and found over 300 species that are associated with just one species of army ant, Eciton burchellii.
It's like a whole miniature ecosystem centered around these ants. And your source mentions that Conehaft and he planned to come back the next day to see this ant-bird butterfly procession, but it didn't happen.
No. The ants had entered their statory phase. It's a period where they're less active. It can last for weeks while they're raising a new generation of ants. And this missed opportunity, it actually highlights a really important finding from the BDFFP. Even relatively large forest fragments can lose their antbirds because there just aren't enough consistently active army ant colonies to support them.
That's pretty wild. So the antbirds depend on the ants, and if fragmentation disrupts the ant populations or changes their behavior, the antbirds could disappear, even if the forest itself looked like it's doing okay.
It really shows how interconnected everything is.
So this brings us to the whole issue of insect diversity and those really concerning estimates of extinction rates. Your source mentions Terry Irwin's famous experiment with canopy fogging in Panama. It led to his initial estimate of 30 million tropical arthropod species.
Yeah, that was a pretty shocking number at the time. And while later research has refined that number, scientists still think there are millions of tropical insect species, at least 2 to 7 million.
So compared to the relatively small number of bird and mammal species, that gives you a sense of how important insects are. Most of the life in the tropics is in the form of these small invertebrates.
You got it.
And then there's the issue of extinction rates. Your source talks about E.O. Wilson's calculations based on the rate of deforestation and this idea called the species-area relationship, which basically says that larger areas support more species. His calculations suggested extinction rates thousands of times higher than the natural background rate.
Wilson's figures definitely caused a stir, both in the scientific world and in the public. While his initial numbers might have been on the high side, the concern about these accelerated extinction rates from habitat loss, that's still a major issue. Your source also introduces this concept of extinction debt. It's the idea that there's a lag between habitat destruction and the actual disappearance of species. Some species might hold on for a while in small, dwindling populations before they finally go extinct.
So it's not always an immediate impact.
Exactly. And then there's the fact that secondary forests are growing back in some places, which is good. But it also complicates things. These new forests don't always have the same level of biodiversity as the original forest. Plus, as your source points out, we know so little about most invertebrates, we might not even notice if they go extinct. Less than 1% of described invertebrate species have actually been assessed for their conservation status.
Wow. That's a lot of unknowns.
It is. It's a reminder of how much we still don't know about these ecosystems.
So this brings us to the big question. What are the broader implications of the BDFFP's findings? And especially, what about the added threat of climate change? Your source explores these questions through the lens of Tom Lovejoy himself.
Yeah, Lovejoy, the guy who started the BDFFP, he's devoted his life to Amazon conservation. Your source even mentions how he once brought Tom Cruise to Camp 41 to try to raise awareness. But he's also cautious about applying the findings from these fragments to the entire Amazon. Large-scale deforestation can actually change things like atmospheric circulation and rainfall.
Really, it's all connected.
It is. And he estimates that if a landscape is fragmented into these 100-hectare fragments, it could lose over half its plant and animal species. That's a pretty scary thought.
Yeah, it is. And your source gives specific examples of species that are either gone or declining in the fragments. Spider monkeys, brown capuchin monkeys, some birds that need the structure of the original forest, even frogs that need these water-filled wallows that peccaries create. And then there are those edge effects, like increased light and heat at the edges of the fragments, which favor some species but hurt others that need the cool shade of the forest interior.
Right. And then you add climate change on top of that. Species might need to migrate to cooler areas as the climate warms, but they can't do that if they're trapped in these isolated fragments.
It's like a double whammy.
Yeah. Lovejoy himself says that climate change adds a whole new level of complexity to conservation. It's not just about protecting habitat in a world we thought was stable. It's about helping species adapt in a world that's rapidly changing.
That's a huge challenge. So your source wraps up with a description of the rainforest at night. This incredible chorus of frogs, a mysterious bioluminescent insect, and those Manaus slender-legged tree frogs. But they also mention going back to the army ant site, and the ants were inactive.
Right, the statory phase. And Cohnhaft uses that to explain the delicate balance of the Amazonian ecosystem. The fact that they missed the procession because of the ant's natural life cycle, it just shows how many other species depend on these complex interactions.
It's a reminder that even small changes can have big effects. So for you listening, the BDFFP has given us some really crucial data on how habitat fragmentation affects ecosystems. It's not just about losing trees, it triggers all these ecological changes. Initial disruptions, a gradual decline in biodiversity, and the vital role of these intricate connections within ecosystems. Those seemingly isolated forest patches are actually revealing so much about what happens when we break up large natural habitats.
Exactly. And understanding these dynamics is so important, especially as we continue to fragment landscapes around the world. The BDFFP shows that even small areas of habitat loss can have huge consequences, and that the impacts can ripple through the entire ecosystem. It's not just the well-known animals, it's the countless smaller organisms that are the foundation of these environments.
So given what we've learned about this intricate web of life from the BDFFP and the challenges of both habitat fragmentation and climate change, it makes you wonder, what's our responsibility in all of this? How can we ensure that these crucial ecosystems remain stable enough for all the amazing diversity they hold? The cost of habitat destruction, it clearly goes way beyond just losing trees. It's something to think about long after this deep dive is over. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.